It is 1967, and the war in Vietnam is in its 12th year. When the United States in 1965 sent troops to support South Vietnam under attack by North Vietnam, it seemed like a good idea, one democracy supporting another against a communist takeover. But 2 years later, there have been heavy losses on both sides, and people are changing their minds. Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara has commissioned a classified study of U.S. involvement in Vietnam since World War II. It will be 7,000 pages long. Military analyst Daniel Ellsberg works on the study. A former Marine and once an ardent supporter of American involvement in Vietnam, he has become an anti-war activist. In 1971, he secretly photographs much of the report and sends it to the New York Times and the Washington Post. The Nixon administration is outraged. National security and freedom of the press are on a collision course.
Hi, I'm Doug Ginsburg, and I'm a federal judge. The case of the New York Times Company versus the United States, also known as the Pentagon Papers case, goes to the very heart of freedom of the press. When the New York Times and the Washington Post began publishing excerpts from the Pentagon Papers in 1971, the government argued that the newspapers were endangering national security. It demanded that the newspapers immediately stop publication. They refused. The government sought a court order to make them stop, and the case quickly moved to the Supreme Court. The key issue was, does the government's attempt to prevent publication violate the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of the press? The First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. The government argued that publication of the papers could result in the deaths of American servicemen. But the court held that the administration could not overcome the heavy presumption against prior restraints, that is, against censorship before publication. After oral arguments and deliberations, the decision, which was issued a mere 4 days after the court heard the case, was 6-3 in favor of the New York Times. It was a 3-paragraph per curiam decision where the 9 justices delivered 9 separate opinions. The court allowed the Post, the Times, and other newspapers to continue publishing the Pentagon Papers without government censorship. The speed with which the court decided this case is noteworthy. It tells us that a prior restraint on political speech will not be tolerated. It is inconsistent with the freedom of the press guaranteed in the Constitution and so essential to the functioning of our system of government.
New York Times Company versus United States was decided in favor of the New York Times and the Washington Post by a 6-3 majority vote in 1971. The key principle was the First Amendment, freedom of the press. This case bolstered the freedom of the press protections of the First Amendment, establishing a heavy presumption against prior restraint, even in cases involving national security.